By the time the remnant interference from the bombardment on Terra had subsided sufficiently, the now isolated C-car made attempts at contact with the Empire. There was no further communication with Mar, and it was suspected that this facility was either cut off as well or completely lost. Once contact with Draconis had been successfully re-established, the information pertinent to the current status of both Mar and Terra, as well as the events leading up to this predicament, were relayed to the Draconis hierarchy. In realizing the temperament of the C-car elite, the news was most likely met with considerable outrage. To date, there had been neither any overt or sustained attacks on Draconian colonies in any form, and this act alone produced considerably more than a simple irritation. A foreign attack on any Draconian system was an attack on the entire Empire, regardless of the location. This particular colony on Terra had also been a very high priority in Draconian terms, as the hybridization project was beginning to show signs of fruition. To further the magnitude of the loss, an apparent misguided direction by the C-car in not extending a protective fleet in some form to this project system had added insult to injury. By the time the ultimate losses of the Mar facility along with the destruction on Terra were assessed, it would be quite remiss not to assume Draconis was now in a state of somewhat unpredictable and uncustomary frenzy. Throughout the advanced history of Draconis, never having faced defiance in any form as had been seen now, had practically reduced their entire hierarchy to a state of debilitating arrogance and superimposed with an impractical vanity. The shock of this event caused quite an affront to the seemingly unabated power of the C-car. This was more than they could, or would, allow. It was unknown at the time whether or not the manned fleet remained, as there were no ships detected or being reported by the colony, though it had to be assumed they were either hidden within the system or close enough to be hunted. Though a Dow fleet could have been ordered to the system, it was immediately determined that this would require a direct C-car response. As such, a rather large frontier fleet positioned near Auriga was ordered into Sol with the sole purpose of eradicating the intruders and re-establishing the Empire bases. It was also being considered at the time whether or not to advance on Lyra once again, based on mere principle, though due to the losses faced in the original war combined with this apparent overpowering in the Sol system by a simple manned fleet, it was decided to wait until the outcome of the coming operation to determine such an option. The elite C-car rightly suspected the man race in Lyra may have accelerated their weapons technology since the time of the earlier war, and so it was determined to hold this potential offensive for the moment. At this time, more Draconian fleet maneuvers had placed them directly on the Lyran border in early preparation should such an operation be ordered. Significant numbers of C-car fleets filled the massive Lyran border, and as such, the area was completely devoid of any outside observers or foreign traffic. For a time, the area was practically a no-fly zone territory to anyone and everyone but the Draconians. Up until the very moment of their arrival, the Draconian battle fleet was in constant communications with their Terran counterparts. It has to be assumed that the Uman facilities on Mar were monitoring these the entire time, as their activities both on and off Mar were suspended to maintain a very necessary lack of detection by the Terran Draconian long-range sensors. In essence, the enemy fleet would be entering the system blind, and an unknown variable would be the actual point of arrival. Another point not lost on the Uman monitoring these transmissions was the lack of information regarding the actual size or numbers of the incoming fleet. As there was no accessible intelligence on any Aurigan movements by Draconis, this became an unsettling unknown. Several contingencies had to have been previously devised by the Uman involving the actual positioning of the insertion point by the Draconian fleet into the system. It might be quite possible a massive fleet could arrive very close to Terra and easily spread out to comb the system searching for them. In which case, any defense of Mar would quickly be overcome once they were discovered, as the entire dispersed Seacar fleet could swarm their position from several different directions, and in essence, they would have lost the element of surprise. This was a worst-case scenario, and it would have meant practical and utter defeat for the tribe to even hold this position against overwhelming odds with not much hope for survival. The most optimal scenario placed a relatively small fleet quite close to Mar, in which case the speed and element of surprise for the Uman strike would expand the odds for success in this instance considerably higher in their favor. With several other contingencies having been closely examined, the Uman prepared counter options well enough to potentially increase their chances whichever the possibility, and as they continued monitoring the Seacar transmissions, were fairly certain of the immediacy of their arrival. Whatever may come and whichever way it turned, the ultimate Uman decisions would have to be fluid, quite explicit, and with sensible resolve. At the start of the arrival of the Draconian fleet, it became apparent that the numbers of craft were steadily increasing in their arrival point as they appeared on long-range telemetry. This was no small fleet in anyone's estimation. It was neither the largest anyone had ever seen since the Lyran War, though placed it in precarious ranking of disturbingly large. The potential odds quickly dropped to roughly less than a 50-50 chance on the best of days. Not entirely hopeful in its initial presentation, though with proper management could be dealt with as long as they could take advantage of any opportunities as they materialized. The insertion point was nowhere near where they had expected either. The fleet was spontaneously located far into the vast open space between Mar and the gas giant fifth planet's orbital plane. A substantial distance away, and yet could buy some time to plan as the hostiles moved, and depending on how they proceeded and what course they should take from there. For a time, the fleet remained stationary, and communications between the Draconian fleet and Terra began to dwindle. It was becoming a waiting game now to see whether their fleet was going to disperse throughout the system or start moving in one direction or the other as a unit. There would have been a fair period of this time frame involved with some concern that they were consistently being scanned for, but the lack of immediate activity tipped their hand that Seacar detection of the installations both on Mar and in orbit above Mar had not occurred. The fact that all facility power except for minimal systems had been cut, and from outward appearances to the Draconians, Mar and her two small moons were now nothing more than just dead real estate. When the Seacar finally started to move the fleet, they were on an intercept course to Mar. In the present system alignment placing Terra on a direct path as well, this presented an interesting set of possibilities. They were either going to stop directly at Mar first, or proceed past them to Terra. If the fleet stopped on the far side of Mar, the Uman could be faced with multiple incoming craft and landing parties, as well as a heavy support fleet remaining in orbit. If the fleet continued past Mar on their way to Terra and no attention was paid to them, things started to look considerably more promising. As it turned out, They were wrong on both counts. As it appeared to transpire, the fleet looked as if it were moving on to Terra, but as it passed Mar, several ships started to descend to the surface. It appeared portions of the fleet were coming into the atmosphere and heading for the surface facilities. Two rather large battle vessels and the remainder of the fleet were on a direct course to Terra. They were splitting the fleet. Now it becomes simply a timing issue. Since the obvious problems of having to face a ground assault of several Draconian landing craft did not pose a very positively anticipated option, it was decided to wait until discovery of the long-range gun emplacements before acting and allowing the larger portion of the fleet to get further away. This apparently did not take very long at all. Before the incoming craft even made touchdown, rapid fire began from atmosphere on the surface facilities. To avoid immediate and complete loss of the guns, power-up of these facilities and return fire began, but the long-range firing was directed upon the large cruisers heading for Terra. By the time the assault craft arrived, the hidden Uman fleet within the orbiting station had begun to bear down on the now approaching surface force. As had been hoped for in nervous anticipation, the Draconian forces now approaching close to the surface were quickly being eradicated before they could either destroy the gun platforms or get to any of their facilities. During this extremely short period of time, the long-range guns apparently did their jobs as the distant fleet making haste to come about and advance on the Uman did not include the large battlecraft sitting in a disabled state in their current positions. As such, the guns continued firing on these targets until such time as the Uman guns were destroyed by the remaining incoming Seacar. With the large battle cruisers apparently out of action, it was now a ship-to-ship conventional battle. Or so the Uman would mistakenly believe. Large battleships of Seacar design not only carried many small assault craft, but also highly advanced and capable long-range cannon, which could in a short time literally raze entire planets. It had been a long-standing tale that some civilizations had been vaporized out of existence by several of these ships from far orbit. Once the ship-to-ship battle of Mar was fully underway, the two Seacar battleships' guns opened up directly on the orbiting station and in a fairly short time rendered it damaged beyond use. It became immediately obvious that the remainder of the Uman fleet had to attack these cruisers directly. Success or failure now depended on removing both these craft and their guns as soon as possible. Seeing the manned fleet heading for the cruisers, the Draconian ships continued their bombardment on the ground and subsurface facilities. Losses to the Uman in these installations was sizable, even with many short-range weapons capable of knocking down these craft. The extensive numbers of Seacar became somewhat overwhelming. Several small asteroids were now being fired at the Draconian cruisers by the terraforming units from the asteroid belt long before the Uman attack ships could get there. Prior to these projectiles hitting their mark, and after substantial losses to the Uman ships in their direct assault on the Draconian battleships, the massive Seacar guns were finally silenced, though up to this point had done massive damage to the surface of Mar, utterly destroying all surface facilities as well as some of the physical geography. Several of the asteroids struck and incinerated both vessels, though the terraforming craft themselves became victims of Seacar fire by that time as well. Once the large battlecraft had been successfully eliminated, what Uman craft remained from the initial cruiser return fire headed back to Mar in an attempt to slow the obvious losses they were now facing on the surface. In the due course of time, the remaining Seeker attack ships were eventually eliminated, but not without a great cost in both lives and equipment to the Uman. There were absolutely no traces left of the surface facilities, and only dark, burnt rock and soil remained. If viewed from above, it would have been amazing to realize there were any structures ever there. The subsurface installation, originally taken from the Seeker and reinforced by the Uman, suffered similar damage, though for the most part may have been the only reason why any of their people even survived. This had been so very close to an utter loss, and did not take the remaining Uman survivors but a short time to determine that if further draconian support should appear, regardless of fleet size, that this system was in severe danger of becoming an immediate loss. The orbiting station was now nothing more than an empty, burnt-out shell of rock, and there were few ships left of practical use. There were no ships remaining which were long-distance shift-capable, so return to Virgo would require outside intervention. With what little of the subsurface facility remained functional or usable, forced them to contact the Virgo homeworld that either immediate reinforcement or extraction from Sol would be necessary. Though this news was received with somewhat of a triumphant tone for the defeat of the Seeker, the current situation in Sol was still deemed much more troubling. They paid a very high price for their initial successes in Sol, but still the defeat of the Draconian fleet ultimately echoed into the historical legend. It also did not take very long to determine that extraction of the survivors on Mar would be required. It would take some time to implement a delivery of resources and personnel to this far-flung system, even though the future rewards would be something to think about. In the short term, though, the best course was to salvage the situation rather than further commit to it, especially with the losses of both men and material. It is ultimately determined that eradication of the Draconians in this system would be difficult at best, and that only containment of them could work for now unless a serious committed investment of resources from many tribes was made to seize, hold, and ultimately take the system. Also knowing full well there is an unknown number of existing Draconian facilities deep underground on Terra, ultimate Terran surface as well as Sol system control could, in effect, buy some time to keep Draconis at bay in order to perform a sort of planetary cleansing of the Seeker on Terra. A brief discussion then presented itself that soon the time might come to look at an attempt to place man's presence on Terra, with both the proper resources and especially the gamble that this defeat may set the Draconians far enough back that they may rethink their position here and elsewhere. It could be feasible that only now might man hold the upper hand in future Seeker decisions to rashly throw their perceived weight around. Having closely observed the stagnant position of the Armada near Tulliran space, which was remaining fixed in their positions and not moving into the system, this thought started to gain notable bearing amongst the tribal leaders. Without truly realizing what had actually transpired in Sol, Draconis opted out of further confrontation with man in Lyra, and it may directly be this event in Sol that turned the tide between the two races. Portions of the Armada near Lyra were recalled to safer positions closer to and within the Empire. A new redirection seems to have come from Draconis as well. Most of the remote expeditionary forces were recalled to well inside Empire borders, as no further far-reaching extension of the Empire, which could possibly require stretching resources, could be allowed for the time being. It would be better to stand firm on the Empire borders than to risk thinning to isolated and unsupportable outposts. This particular outcome of the Sol battle was unexpected and yet quite welcome, as now travel past Empire borders was no longer quite a dicey prospect and allowed for freer and unhindered movement of all the races. As for the Draconians effectively trapped on Terra, it had become quickly apparent they were no longer facing Empire fleet support and that only emergent resupply or irregularly scheduled transports might be their only other option. Draconis, still in their never-ending mindset, considered Terra an Empire colony, though since it is not physically located within Empire space, had become a sort of long-distance stepchild of the Empire, and yet their refusal to relinquish the colony still burned quite deeply. For the time being, the Terran Draconians realize they are on their own. The extraction team from Virgo finally arrived in Sol, and on inspection of the surface of Mar could see for themselves some of what their brethren had faced. The surface was littered with the remains of numerous bent and twisted craft, some of which were retrieved in salvage for either their components or useful materials. Once the equipment in the underground facility had been sufficiently salvaged, a massive device was detonated from orbit to effectively reduce the facility to a non-existent state. If the Seacar wanted to reclaim this world, they would have to start over. The return to Virgo was long and sad, though what had been accomplished here still held some measure of triumph. In time, man would return to this system, and the next time they would be much better prepared.